Okay, well, welcome everybody to the UKCCSRC conference. Thank you for those who came, and big thank you as well to those who are attending online. Apologies for starting late. For those of you who have come to our conference in person, you know it's very difficult to get people away when they just haven't seen each other for 6 months and they're busy catching up. But we'll try and make it worth you while attending. I'm not going to say very much. We're going to get the local team in very shortly to give us the Edinburgh slant on things. But what I'd like to think about is how this is the 10th conference, 10-year anniversary conference for the UKCCSRC. We started with a 2012 grant. We're just coming to the end of the 2017 grant. And I was, as one does, thinking back to 2012 and what was going on then. And one of the things I was thinking about, which was particularly relevant for the situation now, is that back then we were still thinking that we might get CCS going, and Europe as a whole was going to get 20 CCS projects by 2020. That was the target. And the UK had £11 billion in the CCS levy in the 2010 Energy Act. And we'd gone to a bit of trouble to get that CCS levy so that it would cover CCS from any fuel. It was originally going to be just coal, but it was actually expected that the bulk of the projects would be new supercritical coal plants, each producing about, I think, 3 million tonnes of CO2 a year, and there'd be about 10 of them. And as I say, these would all have had CCS, and in fact, they would have almost certainly by now have had some biomass going in, getting negative emissions. The projects didn't go ahead because of the recession, and then because shale gas kept natural gas prices low for a while, and because, as somebody said to me this morning, you'd never have a chance of getting a project on coal going. Of course, if we still had those plants now, right now, we'd feel pretty good, and they would be in use, and not only would they be providing an alternative to Russian gas, but as I say, they'd actually be taking CO2 out the atmosphere. I think it isn't just the prejudice against coal and against fossil fuels in general, irrespective of having CCS that stopped them. As I say, I think there was good economic reasons at the time. But it is an example of how, even now, and even with all the issues we've still got to get people concentrating, not on superficial things like, are you using fuel, are you using coal, whatever, but actually, how does it matter, first of all, for energy security? Because think about it as we might, if people are not able to function because of lack of energy, they'll make that the priority. No question about that. And that's something we're going to see, I think, changing the debate on CCS a little bit. But also, in the long term, we've got to stop putting CO2 in the atmosphere. And indeed, now we've got to pull some CO2 out. So I think there's some messages there going back 10 years, and I think it'll be at least another 10 years before we get on top of them, that really we do have to get an objective view of the climate problem and an objective view of CCS. And part of that will be making some projects happen successfully, and part of it will just be then people really facing up to the much more complex mix of problems around climate change that we have to deal with, not just stopping using fossil fuel, but using it in a way that doesn't put CO2 in the atmosphere. And finally, one other thought about the 10 years. It's 10 years, obviously, since we started UKCCSRC 2012. It's 20 years since I and Stuart and Hannah and a few other people roughly started working on carbon capture and storage. It's about that. And it's only 30 years until we're supposed to be at net zero. And to me, 20 years seems like a flash in the pan. So there's just no time gone. So really, we've got three more UKCCSRC phases, and then it's net zero. That's a lot of work. So I think we've got plenty to talk about at the conference. Thank you. So I'll pass on to Stuart Haszeldine, Professor of CCS at the University of Edinburgh, who maybe needs very little introduction, but a geologist who's spread out into a lot of other areas on CCS, and always been very, I guess trenchant is the right word, He's had a lot of good ideas about CCS that he's not been afraid to talk about, and he's made a great impact on the progress of CCS in the UK and globally. So please, Stuart, the floor is yours.
Right, thanks very much, John. And of course, in this mutual loving, we wouldn't have had all these UKCCSRC centres without John writing the grant bids. So that's genuine academic success. So I'm going to just briefly take 10 or 15 minutes to introduce a few things. So first of all, welcome to Edinburgh. Anybody who's not been here before, welcome to this part of Edinburgh, people who are from the west side of town. And also, welcome to the science site. I'm just going to say a few things about science site before we start off. But Edinburgh, of course, on the bottom strap lines there, I've talked about before as being the place where carbon dioxide was first discovered in the world in the late 1700s. Edinburgh, geologically, of course, also was the place where geological time was first realised in a qualitative sense to prove that the biblical hypothesis of the flood followed by sedimentation was not correct. And then less well known as Edinburgh was the first application of radiometric dating to rocks to give an absolute number of years of age date for rocks to realise that the world was actually hundreds and thousands of millions of years old, not a few thousand like physicists thought. So that's good. Next slide, please. So on the science site here, John talked about a 10-year anniversary for UKCCSRC. So this is the 100-year anniversary of this science site. This is, I think, one of the first, probably the first out-of-town science park in Britain. Started in the 1920s. Edinburgh University, ever cautious with its own money, had an appeal for everybody else to pay for the chemistry department, and everybody else did pay. And King George the Fifth turned up to cement in the foundation stone, which is now buried somewhere inside the red brick chemistry building. Because being chemists, they didn't waste any money on architecture shit like that. They just wanted more laboratories. So King George V opened that up, and they obviously gave him a good meal and said, look, could we call this place King's Buildings, and we'll tap you for some more money. So that all worked as well. So that's why it's called King's Buildings. And the first building was chemistry, which is there. That's the West Main. Mains is Scots word for farm, if you like. So this is the farm site. That's the farm building on the other side of the road. That's the chemistry department there in 1922. And where I've written geology arrived about 1926 or 28. And just underneath the L of the geology is the coal-fueled power plant for the King's Buildings site, which is now completely disappeared, of course, but we're early into, and where we are is on the southeast on the Swan Building. So that's all built up and happened and carries on happening, becoming more and more densification. Of course, you've probably walked through the site and seen the buildings happening. But I want to pick up on John's point about multiple deliveries and also false starts and going backwards and forwards. And CCS is absolutely not, I think, a done deal. And I think we're seeing more of a polarization between the NGOs who've been on the fence are now taking positions very solidly against carbon capture and storage, whereas a lot of the industry and business developers are trying to get on the bandwagon, and they see us, with strong government support in the UK and to some extent in Europe, see a real opportunity. So this report came out, I don't know, a couple of weeks ago, Carbon Capture Crux, from the Institute of Energy and Economic Financial Analysis, which is an independent thing which usually does quite good reports on renewables and looking forward. But this is really solidly against CCS and goes through all the industrial projects around the world, etc., to show in their own mind how bad they are. But the general, so I'll leave you to read that if you want at your leisure. I wrote a blog about that on the bottom right-hand side. But the general point is that there's a strong view out there that CCS is just greenwash and is not necessary and is just a big scam by the fossil fuel industry. Whereas I think it's probably the opposite of that the fossil fuel industry is quite happy doing what it's doing and sees CCS as still rather an imposition and something they're going to have to do. So lots of skeptics, CCS still contested, and overall CCS still really has an inadequate track record. If you compare that with mobile phones or photovoltaic cells, you can't point to a whole curve of cost reduction. And so here's one example. This is the largest CCS project in the world, of course, at Chute Creek, separating something like 70% carbon dioxide from 30% methane with Exxon. That runs at about 6 or 7 million tonnes a year potential, but it's only been running at half that potential for most of its life. So in this report, the CO2 captured and stored on the left doesn't count because that's gone to enhance oil recovery. The CO2 on the right was captured but vented because there was no market for the CO2 at the time. So that in this analysis counts as a failure, and that's what we're up against. Whereas I would say that this is actually underperforming because of a lack of regulation. Why would the state government or the federal government let you capture pure CO2 and then vent it? You know, this I think is a crazy way of behaving, and we should call out governments for allowing this around the world. And I think I don't know, but I could ask the question of anybody in the room who's involved in the current 2 cluster projects, what will be the penalties for underperforming? Will you have to pay just the European emissions price for venting CO2 if the storage isn't working, or will you pay double UTS price? So there's a reputational risk there which we're about to run into. I'm not sure we've had enough conversation about. And of course these projects should work. They're being really competently designed by international teams of people who know what they're doing. This should be injecting by 2026, making hydrogen, solving large percentages of UK emissions. So these are flagship projects, but they've really got to work at industrial scale, at hydrogen manufacture scale, at power plant scale. And of course, we've never actually really managed to do that. So I don't underestimate the challenge of doing this in an integrated way. And one of the first projects up will be Drax. Drax, I think, aim to be doing bio-CCS around 2026 and having that in the ground. And I think that's, well, I don't see why, tell me why that's not a really complicated project, because nobody's ever done biomass capture before at that large scale. It's been done at 1 and 2 and 5 megawatts, but never at 2,000 megawatts. Lots of things to put together, lots of variable flue gas, and that we should pay more attention to trying to help Drax to work properly. But at the other end of the scale, this meeting's about ranges of scales of delivery. This, I think, is probably the most successful carbon capture plant in the UK at the moment. Okay, this can capture about 30,000 tonnes a year of CO2. It's not stored, it goes to medical use, it goes to drinks use as well. But this captures from an anaerobic digester, or 2 anaerobic digesters really. So this is bio-capture, so this is negative emission effectively captured at a very low price, about $20 a tonne, something like that, and can be transported, is sold as dry ice, sold as liquid CO2, and works commercially without any subsidy at all. So at that end of the scale, there's a whole grassroots where we're missing out on opportunities of several million tonnes a year of bio-CO2 around the UK. So it's not just about big projects. These are small projects. This works fine because the people who are involved in it need this to work to make their living. So they make sure that it works. And the plan for the future, the global plan, not the global plan, the UK plan for the future, projected in the future. This is a slide from Ruth at Carbon Capture and Storage Association, but I've imposed on that 2 curves of what this means from 2023 forward in time towards 2050, that to do the minimum, the UK minimum, 30 million tonnes a year, really means starting drilling 4 boreholes a year about now, and that's clearly not going to happen. So we've got a very good chance of being late. If we want to go the top curve for the 120 million tonnes a year by 2050, what you've got to be on is then moving on to a track of 14 boreholes a year. And of course, a borehole is anything between 10 million and 50 million, depending on where you're going to put it down. So that's a lot of money. And I don't see very much incentive for the companies involved to drill those up front without a guarantee of where the CO2 is coming from and a guarantee of operation. So again, there's lots of scope for things going wrong. I'm sure Bayes is paying great attention to this, but it's a really big coordination project, and lots of moving parts have to work together at the same time. And I'm concerned that there's plenty of chances for that to be late, plenty of chances for parts of that to go wrong, and therefore plenty of chances for the skeptics to come in and say CCS still doesn't work, even the UK hasn't managed it. And of course we're making progress. Here's the first ever offshore licensing round, issued on the 14th of June. I think bids close September the 13th, so you've still got a chance to bid if you want a CO2 site. I think there's members in the audience who will happily talk to you about the rental. And there we are. So what we've got to do is develop more and faster CCS. As John said, we're late globally. Oil companies, I think, are doing a bit, but they're not doing nearly enough. You know, out of the billions of dollars of profit, they're spending perhaps 5% on investing in CCS, and that should be 55 or 85%. How can we use this UK experience to make sure CCS works? And especially, we don't have any conversation about how we're going to globalize that experience and send that to other countries. Large projects, clearly from the Round the World review, from that financial report I talked about earlier on, are under-regulated. The penalties for failure and underperforming are not nearly severe enough to make those operators work. And the UK has a whole range of projects, both at the hugest scale and at the individual farm scale. So that's all I've got to say.
Shall we just see if there's any quick questions for Stuart? That's what we've got him. What he said is fresh and ready. Don't run away, Stuart. I've got one question. You mentioned early on, you know, what should the penalty be for non-compliance, and you said double the emission cost. Do you think that's a fair penalty, or?
No, it should be about 4 times the emission price. So. Because I think the penalty has to be worth penalising with. So it's in my take on Gorgon in Australia is Gorgon doesn't work because they've allegedly got sand production out of the boreholes. Now, if that was an oil field producing oil, you'd have that fixed in 3 months by drilling some more boreholes. But it's been dragging on for years and years and years because the penalty for Gorgon is just paying the local emissions price for every tonne of CO2 emitted. Now that's my impression. I may be wrong, and I would welcome somebody to correct that, but the price of failure is tiny.
And I mean, when you think we'll be able to tell projects they've just got to be net zero, and if they let CO2 go, they'll have to pull it back out the air?
Well, I think that's what the UK government should do, is place the mandate on the companies, actually, because if you just deal with trading certificates, then all these companies have much smarter traders than people have legislators in the government. So I think you should just legislate for the outcome you want, and pricing it is discovered on the way through. That's for the companies to sort out. But what we want is less CO2 emitted, and what we want is to progressively remove CO2 out of the atmosphere. And I don't think, you know, I can understand why we're giving subsidies for the first projects, but that's not the enduring regime. That's just a very short transition at the start. So I would argue we could actually be moving the Track 2 projects into a mandate and say that we want X millions of tonnes a year from the UK to be captured and stored. How you do it, who you do it with is entirely up to you, but we'll need to see verification. I realise that's not a popular point of view, but I'm trying to get... We've had attempts since 2005 at trying to price CO2, and clearly that's really difficult for government to judge.
Any other questions? Okay. All right, well, I think we're just on time, which is unusual. Amazing. Thank you very much, Stuart. So now we'll pass on to Hannah Chalmers. Hannah Chalmers, as I mentioned at the start, has been working on CCS in 2022, when as I think a first-year undergraduate student at Imperial College. We obviously didn't work our students hard enough at Imperial College then. She had a bit of time on her hands and wanted to do a summer project, on putting CO2, I think, into the Magnus field. It was going from somewhere west of Shetland via the Shetland Islands, where the CO2 would be taken out, and then we could put it in other storage. And she looked at the project where the gas would be turned into electricity, sent back to the mainland, and the CO2 sent on. So that was a good project, and she got, as I remember, the first MP who took a real interest in CCS, Bob Blizzard, engaged. So Hannah actually did quite a lot to get CCS in the policy debate. And as I say, that was back in 2022 when she was a first-year undergraduate. She hasn't changed a bit since, actually.
Back in 2022.
Sorry, 2002, Hannah. Sorry, senior moment there. I've changed.
You're only.
I've changed a lot. No, she's very hard-working. We're very glad to see her here, spending some time with us on CCS, and I'm sure she's got quite a lot to tell you over those 20 years. So, floor's yours, Hannah.
Thank you. I was trying to do cameras. I think I'm going to lurk over here if that's okay for the desk. And I'll check I can do slides. Cool. Right, so yes, my name's Hannah. I've been doing CCS for a while, and John may have looked at my slides. I've been doing CCS stuff for around about 20 years, and John phoned me and said, so will you do me a keynote for the conference? I'm like, yes, what would you like me to talk about? He said, I don't know, just give some perspective. I'm like, okay. I thought, okay, let's just talk about what I've done and some of the different perspectives that I've had at different points in my career. So, one of the great things about these meetings is that many of you are early in your research careers. You're perhaps just starting out in a PhD or partway through it. Maybe you're early in your first lectureship, that kind of thing. So I thought it would be useful to show some of the things and some of the kind of stuff that I got involved with and was able to kind of enjoy and influence, even as an early career researcher, and to some extent, particularly as an early career researcher, because there's all sorts of fun things that you can do when you're a bright, fresh PhD student that people want to talk to, than when you get a bit further on and you're too busy trying to do the next lecture and where's the welcome week talk and blah, blah, blah. So I'm going to offer some sort of personal reflections on an academic path over 20 years to where I've got to so far, and also weave in some stuff around what's been happening with CCS across those 20 years. Some of you, of course, have been doing this roller coaster at the same time as me. There may be some memories. Yours will be different to mine. So when we get to the bit at the end, if there's other things that you think are kind of useful perspectives to share and to kind of have in the room, then do feel free to add your own. This is just my take on things, what I have seen as I've been going things through kind of CCS and so on in the last 20 years. So I put slides together in a little quicker than I had intended, and some of them are animated when I didn't intend it to be so. Everyone starts as an early career researcher if they go down an academic path in some ways. As John says, I made use of the Undergraduate Research Opportunities Programme at Imperial College and then went on and did a PhD. And yeah, the first thing I did was this sort of project around could you take CO2 from here to there and include CCS and all that stuff. And to some extent, it was just an exercise in exploring some of the aspects of CCS that kind of made you start to think about how to get a project to go together, bringing some of the engineering and economics ideas together. And because I was a PhD student or a kind of early career researcher, there was an opportunity to go and show that kind of thing in Parliament because they had special poster sessions for students to go and show their work. He wouldn't have been invited, it was me that was invited to do that. It was me that was able to write to MPs and say, hey, we've got this thing at this reception, would you like to come have a look? So it was really nice to have that opportunity, even as someone very early on, just starting out, to just let people see what I was thinking and to share those ideas and see where it went. And as John said, a couple of MPs who were kind of interested came along and had a look, and we spoke about things after. Perhaps taking a step back, though, I joined the energy research community at a kind of interesting time. So in the year 2000, the Royal Commission on Environmental Pollution had sort of had a big look at energy, and that led to a kind of quite important white paper in 2003, which I think was when the UK really brought environment into energy policy, or brought these things together. So for the first decade or so of my career, there was quite a lot of kind of enthusiasm in the idea that we were going to use energy to solve the environment problems, and it was all going to be great and wonderful. And that was a fun place to be. So, we you could do these things where, energy was interesting to MPs. I also, was able to be involved with public outreach stuff. When you're a bit younger, there's some people that find it easier to associate with you. And you probably know a bit more than them, even if you don't feel as expert as you perhaps would want to in some situations. Somebody decided that they were looking for a group of people who would be modern Brunels in a Radio 4 programme, and I got my first opportunity to do BBC type stuff, which was kind of fun. And again, they wanted someone that was a bit younger and a kind of emerging person to be part of that that show, alongside a couple of a marine guy and so on. So there's lots of fun things that you can do early in your career. You can also spend time away from your home institution as a PhD student. I spent a whole month with Sask Power when they were working on what would become the Boundary Dam project. I had no idea what they were doing, but it was really great to be able to sit alongside actual engineers and to meet other people in the company. And I learned much more about electricity and power and how the economics really works in that month than I would have done in 10 years of reading papers. And I also spent a month with the Electric Power Research Institute in San Francisco, or near San Francisco. So, there's a whole bunch of stuff that you can do early in your career that really is enriching and makes connections and experiences that stand you in good stead as you go on to whatever you choose to do next. Where were we in CCS during this period? So that top right is a figure that John and I drew, which ended up in a Viewpoint article in Energy Policy. The idea is probably still not that far off. The dates are a bit wonky. He laughs. So talking about the idea of, so the technology is fine. Even back then, we were pretty sure we had technology that would, broadly speaking, work. There's details of using technology in a new context, but the technology is there. There's a whole bunch of other stuff that you need to do to get large complex projects working, and that means that projects do need help, particularly if they're projects which are about doing things differently so that we help the climate without actually making extra energy, as you might see, for example, in renewables projects. So we did that kind of work and kind of put some ideas out there for people to think about. Social science colleagues did say, have you heard of appraisal optimism? Do you know that these things normally take a while? And we went, oh yeah, no, we get it, but it's fine. This is going to be different. There's lots of momentum behind it, but maybe they had a point. And we did also get started early in the UK on thinking about regulation and getting the different bits and pieces of regulation and kind of knowledge in the regulatory bodies going as well. So the second piece along here with an Environment Agency logo on it is work that was done, commissioned from John and I and others in our group, that was looking at, okay, so how do we do carbon capture and storage readiness properly? So we knew in that decade that not every power plant was going to be built with carbon capture straight away. But we did look at, well, how can we get these plants to be ready to use carbon capture as soon as possible if you're about to build a large number of new gas plants or indeed coal-fired power plants, depending where in that decade you are. So that idea that there is a kind of link between the academic community and the regulatory community and other communities, I think, is quite important. And as academics, we are able to kind of contribute knowledge and expertise that perhaps the regulators can't have in quite the same depth in-house, because there's only so much resource in each of the regulators that we work with. That logo in the middle, UKCCSC, that's the first version of the logo that's evolved into what we know and love today. So we have started with a UKCCS consortium and then a UKCCS community network before we even got to the research centre in 2012. So I'm not sure if I want to make people show their hands to see if they remember this when it was the one that we actually used, but that's where we started. And I think one of the things that's great about the CCS community in the UK is that we do have a research community and a linked industrial community. We've worked really hard on that over many generations. We've worked hard on people getting to know the language of others doing CCS in other parts of the chain. So when I was going along at these meetings and helping them perhaps presenting work, I got to learn the language and some of the kind of key points of the geologists, of the CO2 transport people, of the economists, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's something to be proud of, and it's really great to see many people here, and I'm sure more online, who are kind of continuing that tradition of being interested in the whole big picture of CCS, as well as their own particular bit of work that's kind of for them and that they're focused on and specialist in. So I did my early career stuff. got a lectureship, also have a slide that's got more transitions than I wanted. And my lectureship was here, so I've been in Edinburgh since 2010. And when you're new and academic, you do spend a lot of time focused on your teaching. So there's not going to be a whole bunch of teaching stuff in this presentation, but I did teach thermodynamics for several years. It did take a very long time the first time. For anyone who is an early career academic, people will tell you not to spend too much time on it. Do your best. You will spend too much time on it. It will pass. There will come a time when you don't spend quite so much time thinking about every lecture. It's okay. But yeah, so that kind of working with students in a different way, helping to form, in my case, professional engineers, is a very important part of my role. So it's still important that I do what I do in carbon capture and the contributions that I make in this community. But it's also important to me that I spend some of my time working with my students, helping people that are early in engineering careers decide what they want to do, getting them started and kind of thinking about where they want to focus their professional lives, sometimes in CCS and sometimes in other things. So, thinking about career path is just something that academics are doing alongside the other things that they do. John was mentioning in his introduction that in this period, this is part of the period where coal-fired power plants really started to come off the agenda in the UK in a very big way. And gas-fired power plants were getting much more attention, and people were thinking about building new plants, perhaps in quite large volumes and so on. So that work that we started to do a few years back around carbon capture readiness, what should it look like? How should we actually make power plants that can do this in a way that's actually meaningful, et cetera, started to actually come to the fore in terms of being used in policy documents, in probably within some companies, though they don't always tell you exactly what they're doing, etc. The pictures there are from an article that appeared in Trade Press, because it seemed like a good way to let a few people know in an accessible way of the work that we'd been doing and how that might be applied. Again, regulations and the development of the regulatory environment. So at this point, we don't have bespoke CCS regulations. We've got a few projects that are getting quite excited about progressing to doing big things quite soon. So one of the things that we did on the far right was to look at, okay, so with the current set of regulations, what can we do? It's a mishmash of a billion different things that are kind of relevant to a CCS project in some form or another. What do I need to know so I don't mess up? Which of these things might help me, et cetera, et cetera. So we ran a kind of test exercise that looked at what you could do, I think it was in Scotland, with the existing frameworks. For the early career researchers out there, the main person that did the work was a PhD student. At this point, I was an early career lecturer. We were actually able to carve out time and do that work and make that contribution. There were, of course, senior people around guiding the project and all that stuff. But as an early career researcher, you've got valuable expertise. You can look for these opportunities to be involved with kind of using what you're learning beyond your studies, as well as doing that awesome thesis that you're planning to write either now or in a few years' time. And as John said, 2012, UKCCSC became UKCCSRC, and there was a big investment from funders. Importantly for me, there was the money from the Department for Energy and Climate Change, which was about establishing decent-sized pilot-scale facilities in the UK, as well as the kind of money for other kinds of research in the universities. So, that was a kind of important decision in government around the kind of capability that they wanted to have in our research and innovation community. So the momentum's building, it's kind of fun, there's lots of things going on. The British Standards Committee on CCS also started during this period. It has to be said that as a country we kind of had our doubts about whether standardisation might have been a bit early around about 2013, but some other countries in the world were really keen to get going on international standards, so we kind of did get ourselves a committee together so that we were able to contribute to standards making in the areas that were important to us. More personally, I was getting married, I was starting a family, I was promoted in 2015, and the date of the letter is the same day as my second daughter was born. So I opened my inbox after a few weeks to discover all these congratulations, and I was like, but I haven't told anybody yet. I was like, oh, they were all saying well done for senior lecturer. So yeah, it was a good time. There was lots going on, and it was fun to be developing as an early career academic in that environment. Of course, the next period, the second half of the last decade, from 2015 to 2020, was bit quieter, probably a bit quieter. To be honest, I was a bit distracted. I had 2 young children, and I have spent, I've chosen to spend a reasonable amount of time, with my children and not traveling around so much and all that kind of stuff. There was, a big kind of gathering or a kind of expectation around a government competition for a couple of projects that ultimately went pear-shaped, I guess is one way to put it. National Audit Office and others can tell you more about what happened there. And it took a little while after that for people to kind of draw a breath and sort of decide, well, what do we do next? So that kind of approach with a direct competition between 2 individual projects, we kind of understand why people tried that, but perhaps it wasn't the best thing to do on reflection. So that kind of took time for industry and for others to kind of gather their thoughts about what to do next. Of course, meanwhile, the world is spinning and other things are changing as well. So, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is getting quite worried about how much CO2 is already in the atmosphere and thinking that perhaps we need to get more CO2 out of the atmosphere more quickly. And it's not just about dealing with coal-fired power plants, et cetera, et cetera. So there's an awful lot of things that are kind of changing through this period. So in the UK, in some ways, it looks like we didn't do that much. As I say, it's maybe partly that I wasn't looking that closely. But also, the lie of the land and what is CCS actually trying to do in the energy system question, I think, kind of moved on quite a lot in this period. Nowadays we all talk about net zero and negative emissions and all that kind of thing. In 2015, that is not where the world was. And all of that kind of, in a way, happened quite slowly, but in a way has happened quite fast if you're a geologist and you think in geologic time, for example. So I've also thrown up the H21 thing there because for me, I think one of the things that was quite important is the arrival of hydrogen, or the re-arrival of hydrogen, and the suggestion that it's going to have potentially quite a big role in parts of our energy economy. It's partly a personal thing because the reason I chose the H21 thing is that report was published while I was on maternity leave, or maybe just as I was coming back from my second maternity leave. And I was like, whoa, what happened there? The first time I didn't really notice that much different between when I left and when I came back. But when I came back the second time, I was like, hydrogen's just reappeared out of nowhere. What happened there? And it has continued to be a big part of the dialogue around energy in the UK and in other places. In 2015, hydrogen did not come in all the colours of the rainbow. Now it does, etc. So there's very different discourse around hydrogen, and CCS kind of linked up with that, of course, because depending on where you sit in the hydrogen community, CCS may or may not be a big deal for enabling hydrogen to have a big role in the energy economy. Probably goes without saying that, my view is that if you're serious about hydrogen, you need to be serious about CCS as well. Because that's where an awful lot of the hydrogen now comes from resources that need CCS if it's going to be a green way to, shouldn't use green for hydrogen, if it's going to be a good way to reduce CO2 emissions in our energy economy. Now, coming back, I've got no idea how I'm doing for time. I don't know if you care. So coming back to sort of,
I'll stand up.
Yeah, you'll let me know. So I've only got 2 slides, this one and one more. So closer times, so 2020, beginning of the COVID pandemic, one of the last meetings my head of school went to was the promotions committee that year. So I was promoted to reader as the pandemic kind of took over the world, as it happens. So this period here happens to be the COVID bit of our lives. But also is a couple of years that I've spent as a reader. I suppose, again, thinking a little bit about academic path, and those that might be thinking about academic path, what on earth is a reader? We don't really know, to be honest, but it says something about being an experienced academic who's getting stuff done or is able to provide good advice to colleagues, all that kind of stuff. It shows that you're becoming a more senior leader within your organization or within your research community. So what's been going on in the world in the last couple of years? I think a lot of people are feeling much more enthusiastic about CCS in the last year or two than they have been for much of the last several years before that. It does feel very much more like we've got a lot more energy in the CCS community and lots of new faces and new people, not just people coming in to do new PhD projects or whatever, but also expanding teams in government. People are coming back into CCSA membership when perhaps, they hadn't done that for a while, etc., etc. So UKCCS, I think, is quite a kind of bubbly place at the moment. There's a lot going on. There's a lot to think about as well, but there is a lot going on. And I think we're seeing quite rapid development of policy and sort of support mechanisms, also some real money to try to get not just one or two projects, but quite a large number of projects to progress through to actual deployment. So on the one hand, it's quite a risky time and many things could go wrong. On the other hand, I think it's a time where the optimists among us can be like, actually, yeah, there is a lot that could happen and could go well, and we could really be on the cusp of actually doing this and doing it right. So there's kind of much to be kind of hopeful about, I think, and to really think, actually, we are in a different place to 15, 20 years ago when we also had the bubbly community, but we hadn't learned all the things that we have learned in the past few years. One of the things I've thrown up here is the report that was done by Travers as part of the ScienceWise programme, which was around dialogues, doing a kind of deliberative dialogue with the public, with members of the general public. I acted as an expert advisor for trying to set up some of the dialogue work, and David Reiner, who's around here somewhere, knows more than I do because he was involved in the steering group. But yeah, I've put that up because I think we are now at the point where, again, we've got real projects developing. We're going to have real people who are considering whether they want this to be in their backyard or not, or close to their backyard. We're going to have real people listening to stuff in the news about whether it may or may not impact on their bills, etc., etc. So I think it's good to see that there's this kind of careful work going into thinking about, well, actually, who needs to know stuff? What kind of things do they actually need to know, etc., etc. So the report, after all the work's been done and all the conversations have been had and they've all been analysed and thought about, the importance of real examples are actually tangible to the local context of someone that's being asked to have a big project near them is important. How you feel about CCS projects if you live in the industrial heartlands of Northern England is different to how you feel about it if you live in other parts of the country, etc. There are different kind of questions that people want to consider. There's different things that people are balancing up when they decide about projects and whether they're okay with a planning application in their area or near them. It also really matters, as John was saying in his introduction, about what comes with the CCS. So some people are kind of scared of hydrogen, and they don't like the idea that this thing is going to mean that there's hydrogen nearby too. Some people are like, biomass? What? It's just so complicated that they can't even engage with what on earth that project is about, etc., etc. And kind of unsurprisingly, people want it to know that it will work, and they want to know it will be safe. So we need to think about ways that we can demonstrate that it works and that it's safe. We can do that. There's lots of global experience now, but there's, it's getting that in a form that actually makes sense to members of the general public with sensible questions. Again, as early career researchers, believe it or not, you're experts too, and sometimes your involvement in these processes is more helpful than some old grey person coming in and speaking in some language which is remote from the person asking the question. So do kind of own your own expertness and be willing to speak with people if you can. It does matter when it comes from a different kind of voice and that someone that's actually able to relate perhaps a bit more to the questioner sometimes. Final slide, which I'll just I wanted to close with some thoughts of the next 20 years and my reasons to be positive. So I'm ever the optimist. I think Stuart and I are doing the double act this morning or this afternoon. So CO2 storage licensing is happening. It's possible and it's happening. That was not the case 20 years ago. We didn't know how to do that yet. We're having real conversations about business models along the CCS chain. We thought quite carefully about how to sort of chop the chain up so that we get bits of business model that actually make sense and are linked together. There's a huge diversity of sites that are considering CO2 capture deployment, light and day from how it was 20 years ago. Negative emissions and direct air capture are becoming real. There's some quite big projects starting to happen, for real in our country and not far away. So yes, there's much to be concerned about, many things that we need to work on in academia and in industry, but I think we're also in a rather different place to where we were in 20 years, and it gives me hope for the next 20 and beyond.
Okay, thank you very much. And while we've got you, Hannah, there's a question come in. In fact, it might have been for Stuart. I'm a bit unsure, but you can answer it, I'm sure. I'll paraphrase it a little bit. It's from Ben Stuart, I don't know where. Are CCS projects green, and does it matter whether or not they're green?
Are they green? So, I mean, it depends which... Does it matter? So to me it does matter, because the whole point of doing carbon capture and storage is that you're trying to make a contribution to not having dangerous climate change, or having less dangerous climate change than we might otherwise have. So I think it does matter what the environmental quality of a CCS project is, and I think it's appropriate to have the right kind of regulatory and other frameworks around it to get that right. How green are they? An awful lot depends on the project and how well it's been designed and all that kind of stuff. If you were here, I would offer a coffee chat, but clearly. Okay, so
I'll have to ask a follow-on. What do you mean by green, or what does green mean to you?
What does green mean to me? So, I mean, I think for me, carbon capture and storage is obviously focused on carbon dioxide. So it's about getting carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and away from the atmosphere for a very long time. And it's also about doing that in a way that's conscious to all the different other impacts that a big industrial project is likely to have.
Okay. Any other questions from anyone? Yes, over there. Could you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, thank you. Ryan Habala, I'm representing Aqua Carbon Capture. A few years back, I was doing my PhD in the UK, and Peterhead was gaining quite a bit of momentum. And we know what happened with it through a decision from the government and maybe the economic outlook. What do you think we have today as a setting that...
Point of clarification, was that the first time Peterhead gained traction or the second time?
The second time, where it was basically shelved. And so what today is different, and what would be the scenario where all this momentum would be basically shut down? That's the question I have.
So what could make it go wrong? Is that your question in short? So I mean, clearly we live in interesting geopolitical times. And as John said at the beginning, if people start to become concerned about very basic energy provision, then that does get priority. That's Maslow's hierarchy of needs, blah blah blah. So I think in order to be able to think about caring for the climate and doing things that help the climate, you need to be in an economy and a society where your basic needs are met. I appreciate that there's a whole kind of set of stuff around kind of social justice and looking after the planet for future generations, and if we don't do the right thing now, then we're going to trash it for them and all that stuff. But I think there's enough people who are human and will look after themselves now and not necessarily their or someone else's grandchildren, that we really do need to be in a situation where there's enough stability in our economy to be able to think about doing more than just meeting very basic needs. I'm not an economist, so I've probably just mangled at least 3 economic concepts in the last 2 seconds. Above and beyond that, we need to do these projects carefully and right, and with the right regulatory framework around them and that kind of thing, because there's absolutely no value in doing one project really, really expensive with slightly mangled health and safety, and then everyone's like, oh, that CCS thing, it costs a lot and it's really dangerous, I'm not touching that. So it is really important to do these things properly, even if that can cause a bit of frustration in terms of timescales and stuff. So we need the right projects with the right costs, even if support, and we need to have the right regulatory framework around them. Hopefully at some point in these 2 days we'll hear, for example, from the Environment Agency about how we're going to do that in the UK. But yeah, that's a bunch of things that I think of when I hear questions like that.
Okay, just one more quick question.
I'm not sure it can be quick.
Oh, well,
or quickly answer. The question is quick enough. My name is Van Arsbeck, Harry at Watt University. What is your take? I'm sorry, it's not going to be quick. But on the fact that we in the CCS community and maybe also in the biofuels community are fully on board with renewables and all that, and that many people in the renewables community are completely against using CO2 capture and storage and or biofuels. And do you have an explanation for that?
So I suppose there's 2 parts to that. So the question boils down to, there's different tribes in energy. There's the CCS and biofuels types, and there's the true green renewables types and others. And sometimes different tribes find it hard to talk to each other. And I think probably what we need is some people who somehow or another can kind of inhabit and be part of more than one tribe at a time and try to help people understand the perspective of the other. Exactly how we do that, I think, is a long chat for the pub, but with respect to the chairman. But yeah, we need to acknowledge that some people are in very different places, and it's going to be a long conversation. Yeah.
Okay, well, I think we'd better finish there. Thank you very much, Hannah and Stuart. And now we're actually going to hear about regulation. John Henderson from the Environment Agency was going to be here, but is recovering from COVID, so is calling in. John's done a lot of work on regulation. I think he's been working well over 10 years on permitting CCS projects, sometimes more busy than others. But now is certainly, I believe, a very busy time for him, and I'm sure he'll tell us plenty about that. So over to you, please, John. And thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, John. And apologies for not being here. Bit of a post-COVID cough, I'm afraid. So hopefully I'll be able to manage that. Do we have some slides? That I can, marvelous. Next one, please. So it was interesting to get some of the historical perspective on the environmental side of that. Certainly, I was around at the writing of the carbon capture ready regulations, which fell out of the clean coal consultation, if I recall. And we have been using that, the Environment Agency, that set of guidance for, well, since then. And we must have done near on 20 assessments against carbon capture ready. Of course, none of them actually moved on to carbon capture yet, but here's hoping that they do. Who am I? So I'm a regulator in the Environment Agency, and that's just England. So I can only really speak for England, but and that's environmental regulations rather than health and safety or anything else. And as such, there are other regulators and regulations within the UK, though they are kind of similar. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I'm going to run through a number of things. Now, first of all, our focus is not just on carbon capture and the regulations of that. It's all net zero technologies, and there have been an awful lot come forward in recent times. And these technologies, as you would expect, include carbon capture, utilization, and storage, of course. Biomass, BECCS, that was referred to, and direct air capture, DACs. But blue and green hydrogen, I'm afraid I'm going to use colors because it helps me understand which one's which, but also combustion of hydrogen, which will be a newish thing in the UK. The carbon capture technologies that we're looking at be both pre-post combustion, oxy-fuel, alum cycle, there'll be others for sure. And the industries, as already referred to, quite diverse, certainly power, obviously, refineries, energy from waste plant, where we could do some negative carbon capture, cement, iron and steel, there'll be others as well to come. And then we have clusters, which is a new thing, which has featured quite a lot recently, and there was some diagrams there of the Northeast cluster. And there are obviously joined together with CO2 pipelines and hydrogen pipelines. Ultimately, we're talking about storage. A storage of hydrogen will be part of the things that we regulate when it's onshore. And we would do storage of onshore CO2 if there was, but there won't be within the UK or not in the near future. It'll be offshore, and that will actually fall to BEIS to regulate, the Oil and Gas Authority. So as you note, most of these are new or emerging technologies as we describe them. So there's no established environmental standards, and that's a key point about how we regulate these. Next slide, please. Environmental regulations of carbon capture. There's a number of things that have to go through as an operator, and we have provided a few additional bits of information which will be in the conference files, I believe, that you should have access to. But that we have a little guidance note that we've been made available to BEIS, government department who's sponsoring an awful lot of new projects, and that enables operators or potential developers work their way through the environmental side of things. So initially we're talking about planning permission. That's what most operators start with, and that can be local authority planning for some plant, and the bigger plant will be through national infrastructure planning. Slightly different processes, more onerous, the latter, as you might expect, and we are a statutory consultee on that process. Environmental permitting, and that's in England and Wales, slightly different to Scotland and Ireland, as I say. That's what mostly I'll be talking about in terms of detail, because that's the key piece of regulation that we are using. Then we have control of major accident hazards, which we are joint regulator of the HSE and other environmental regulators. That really refers to the storage of hazardous substances. So there's a degree of that, certainly in hydrogen. And then we are also the authority that does the regulation of emissions trading in England, certainly, now known as UK emissions trading scheme. And that's basically the monitoring, reporting and verification of captured, sequestered and then subsequently stored CO2. And that is a key part of the regulations too. Environmental permits, as I say, they are a broad process, but they tackle emissions to air, land and water, and energy efficiency and resource efficiency. So they will address things like abstraction of cooling water, and ultimately they're there to protect human health and habitats. Next slide, please. So a little bit of about what a guidance is, back guidance. As I said, and this is really regulatory speak, I'm afraid, but as mentioned, we don't have standards as such because these are emerging new technologies. Normally, when you're talking about permit, you're working with standards and you're backed up against standards. And these used to be produced through the European Civil process for the UK. Now we have our own process, but suffice to say, these are new processes. So we have to really set out to start off with and develop our own guidance. So a back guidance is what we've called it. They assist applicants and regulators in the permitting process. They are a summary of the available evidence and actually follow a series of criteria listed in the Industrial Emissions Directive, Annex 3, which lists air, land, water, noise, odor, everything that you would expect. They've developed these guidance notes with the industry and agreed with UK regulators, and they will pull out key environmental issues to be addressed and best practice. They're not a regulatory requirement as such. If you've got a better idea as an operator, then you should come forward with that in your application, but they do still act as a good guide. And then they ultimately protect habitats and human health. And there are a number of standards which wider go across all regulations, and those will be delivered through the permit. Next slide, please. So we've published a couple of documents out there in one back guide, and this is for post-combustion capture. The first one, the larger document, is the review of evidence, which thanks very much to John and the UKCCSRC, working with industry and UK regulators. This is aiming post-combustion capture and addresses power, CHP plants, and fueled with natural gas and biomass as an emerging technology, as noted. Now, we actually have a summary guidance then, which we put together, and you'll find it on gov.uk. So that's the key document that highlights the issues. Next slide, please. So that particular guidance, kind of a living document, and we plan to do some updates on it. The next substantial update will include a energy from waste, post-combustion capture on energy from waste plant, and John and UKCCSRC and industry have been working on that. Should be produced later in the autumn. Couple of bits and bobs that got left out first time round. Planned venting of CO2 and bypass of carbon capture units needs to be included in the document, so we'll put in a paragraph or two on that. And then we're hoping to start the review process for refineries in the autumn. And next year, we're looking at other combustion, medium combustion plant and engines, that sort of thing that's not currently addressed. And then moving on to cement, post-combustion capture of cement. It's worth noting as well that we have a couple of other guidances, one for blue hydrogen, which obviously includes carbon capture. That's due out sometime this month, September, and we're currently working on a green hydrogen guidance note. Next slide, please. So here's a picture, just to remind us all what it's all about. I'm sure you'll have seen this. It's possibly as old as some of the first permits that I was involved in, Kings North or wherever. But it starts on the left-hand side with obviously the flue gas, moving through to the cooling, direct contact cooler, and a cleanup of the gas to the absorber stack with an emissions point at the top there. Then the recovery of CO2 in the desorber stack, and then on the right-hand side we have the reclaiming process. Next slide, please. So a couple of pictures of ones that have been built and are up and, well, were up and running. This one was a pilot plant at Ferrybridge, about 100 tons per day on coal. Of course, all gone now. Next slide, please, for a current one. Here we have a carbon capture and utilization plant. This is Winnington, tartar salt or chemicals. And this is a capture for utilization plant, does about 100 tons per day. Been operating about 6 months, so just about completed commissioning. You can see the absorber stack, the taller one with the vent at the top, and the sampling platform. That's the larger of the two columns in the front. Then we have the desorber column. Building on the left has the reclaiming unit, and the large stack in the background is actually the CHP unit that the CO2 has been captured from. About 15% of the CO2 gets captured. The CO2 is intended for food grade or pharmaceutical grade products, and it uses MEA as a solvent, and should prove to be a most useful pilot plant as things move forward. Next slide, please. So a quick run through of the summary of the back guidance conclusions and what we would expect operators to achieve and describe in their permit applications and be permitted on. We expect all the power plants and so on to be designed to be greater than 95% CO2 capture, and that should be achievable. A lot of work been done around demonstrating that. That's obviously an improvement from where we were 10 years ago when it was 90%. We're up to 95% now. CO2 should be fit for purpose. We have a national grid specification for it to pass down the pipeline, but there will be others, I'm sure. It should be designed, or where it's power anyway, should be designed for flexible operation so that it's in a position to support renewable generation. It's recommended that the capture solvent, chosen capture solvent, should be trialed on the or pilot planted on the flue gas for a year to spot any degradation problems and anything else, operational problems, before full commitment. Obviously, as mentioned, you've got to address emissions to air, land, and water. And air, just one of the potential emissions to air. Obviously, amines, as we're probably all aware, can degrade into nitrosamines and other potential carcinogens. And we have what we call an environmental assessment level, which is a health-based level that has gone through the process and identifies potential harm to human health. And operators will be expected to model to demonstrate that there is no harm against that particular level. Energy efficiency, already mentioned, very important, or very sad if too much energy is used up in the process and we're not actually making much headway against CO2. So maximizing heat integration, very important. Cooling as well. We'd be pleased to see once-through cooling where it's possible, not always possible. Not so keen on air cooling, but maybe necessary in some places. And that's to maximize efficiency, as you would expect. And then ultimately, monitoring both the process and the stack emissions will require monitoring, and there'll be conditions in the permit for that. Next slide, please. So this is a very busy slide from the guidance, and it's one that John put together, which really takes us through the environmental parameters associated with designing a capture process with amines. You start basically by choosing your solvent, and that really sets an awful lot of the parameters around that. Then maintaining the solvent to ensure it doesn't degrade or more degradation. Not only are you losing your solvent, and there's an inefficiency in itself, but you're more likely to be having degradation products released from your plant, which is also not a good thing. And then ultimately, to prevent emissions being released, it's important to have the appropriate scrubbing in place, which could be water or acid scrubbing units, and then monitoring at the top of the stack to demonstrate that the emissions are not causing any harm. Next slide, please. So a few thoughts then for what's next around the regulation of carbon capture. This is obviously a new area that requires some thought. So we have certainly found, and operators also have found, that the existing modeling facilities and are not don't really address the chemistry of amines in the atmosphere. It's possible for amines to degrade through contact with hydroxyls and other chemistry in the atmosphere. So modeling that to ensure that we've picked up any additional degradation post the stack, as it were, is an important part of the application. As noted, we need monitoring methods, and these we like them to be certified. So we're currently working with NPL, National Physical Laboratory, are around developing new monitoring methods for amines and degradation products. They've done a literature survey. They're moving on now to desk-based trials with bottled gases of amines and things like that. And ultimately we'll move on to doing some real work at the Tata site, looking at real emissions and processes, and ultimately that will go on to certified standards, which will be included in permit. Then obviously there's quite a wide selection of amines that can be chosen for capture, and they each will have their own specific degradation products. So we have a process that goes through identifying the health impacts associated with those and consulting with the UK Health Security Agency around that, who are the experts. So we have a proposal that we're just putting out to industry at the moment that really enables some hierarchy, some priorities put around a large list of those in terms of toxicology first, and then ultimately moving on to identifying ones that hopefully will be used in anger, so to speak. That's another document that's available through the CCSRC. New thing, obviously, clusters as mentioned. There must at some stage be some thought to bat for clusters. Obviously, we're talking about installations and regulating sites, but ultimately we could have multiple sources of amines released from a cluster, which needs some thought, and heat integration, clearly another important aspect about clusters to maximize the energy efficiency across the whole process. Needs some thought. Disclosure of amine emissions to air. This is something that's exercised us and operators quite a bit over the last year. The regulations, the EPR regulations, require that any emission to the environment is identified and declared, and the concentration reported into the public domain. So that doesn't fit necessarily very well with a proprietary solvent. Some manufacturers are not so keen on that. So we've had a lot of discussions with some of the vendors and are working with them carefully, some of them anyway, to find ways through that will satisfy everybody, including the regulations. Utilization of CO2 and capture. It's not actually an activity in EPR at the moment, so potential gap there. I was talking to DEFRA at the moment to potentially introduce that, just to make sure they're not missed. And then CO2 is a coma substance, not actually so at the moment, and really should be, we think, particularly where we're talking about large-scale storage of CO2 prior to transport by ship. So you could very easily have a major accident to the environment. Well, not very easily, but hopefully, but it's a potential, and that's what coma looks at. Inevitably, other priorities, and that's hopefully what you chats may give us a clue about as we move forward. And next slide, which I think says, any questions?
Any questions? Yes, in the middle there.
Hello, my name's Daniel Salt from the University of Leeds. So you speak a lot about amines, and there's a lot of issues with accidental release, hazards to human health and environment. And you're writing a lot of policy about how to regulate these. You're gonna have to rewrite this policy for, there's a lot of other carbon capture solutions and solvents out there, and certainly a lot in upcoming literature where people are trying to move away from amines. So you're gonna have to rewrite this legislation and this guidance each time?
In essence, yes. That's absolutely the process. As new processes come forward, we are required basically to provide guidance around how to regulate them, and it is only guidance. It's not legislation as such. It's a guidance note. So as new processes come forward, and we fully expect they will do, when there's evidence, we will be in a position to put together alternative guidance notes. And who knows, it may be some are better than A means.
What about, say, like a generalized guidance? Would that be possible rather than having to, rewrite this each time?
Not so easy there. Obviously, with amines, there are specific issues around degradation products and so on. So we have to identify those and have to pull those out and have to make the information available to applicants. Alternatively, it would be, I mean, the initial link that was provided on the first slide or second slide, I believe, has a link to general guidance around environmental issues as a whole that potential developers should contemplate as and when they set to in developing new processes. So that kind of gives a lead through in terms of, the things that you should consider when you're developing these processes.
Thank you very much.
From on the web, from Rick Jelaternik, if I've said that right. What about 70% capture? And he says that will be cheaper. I'm not sure I agree with that, but would 70% capture be allowed if it was cheaper, John?
Unlikely, John, I'd have thought. You'd have to, I mean, there's never no in any of these things, particularly when you've got an emerging technology. If you've got a really good reason why 70 is appropriate, then for sure, put it forward and we'll review it and discuss it and come to a conclusion. I mean, we may be talking about, I don't know, 70% capture from a cement plant, for example. Well, all we've looked at so far is power and energy from waste. And I think, John, we're anticipating 95% is achievable from energy from waste plant too. And it must be obviously said that this is capture when the whole process is working. If the transport and storage goes down, then because we're looking at the installation, we will essentially stop accounting against that 95% capture requirement.
Okay, I don't know who was first, but you had a question? Okay, who was first? I didn't see. Call to the linesman there. Okay. Yeah, up there. Sorry.
How you doing? Daniel Mullen here from doing a PhD in Edinburgh, but now doing a brief stint down in Sheffield. My question is regarding the current thinking from a permitting perspective on startup and shutdown of plants, and how does what's the thinking around emissions during those events, I suppose you call it?
Yeah. So we startup and shutdown is absolutely part of the permitting process. And if you're acquainted with straightforward combustion without any abatement on it for CO2, the startup and shutdown process is regulated already. There is less of an expectation about meeting NOx emissions, for example. But when you come to CO2, there's been a lot of work done, and John will hopefully point to it, around capture during startup and shutdown, capture of CO2 during startup and shutdown, such that you have some extra inventory of amines on site, and you're able to capture during the startup process. Maybe additional NOx, so you might need to run your SCR a little bit harder. So it's absolutely expected that capture can happen during startup and shutdown. Whether it will or not remains to be seen with real practice. And ultimately, we have to allow operators, facilities to essentially optimize their process and trial their process. But yes, it is expected there will be capture during startup and shutdown for power.
We've got the person who wrote the report on that in the audience. Put your hand up, Clem. Just go and see that gentleman there if you want to get chapter and verse. Right, quick one, Stuart, because we're into coffee time.
Stuart Haszeldine from Edinburgh. If you permitted a plant with 95% capture and it turned out that it was only running with 70% capture, what action do you take? Do you just let them get on with it and send them a nasty letter, or do you actually lock the gates and prevent them from operating?
Probably somewhere in between. But ultimately, if they design a plant that can't capture at 95%, we would be sending some fairly strong notes to them and gradually moving down the enforcement process. We have to give operators plenty opportunity to get the plant and process right. But it's just if they exceeded their emission limit values as well, we give them a little bit of leeway and hopefully work through till it's up and running the way it should do. But ultimately, if there's harm being caused, then that would be a problem.
Okay, and I might add under the power support mechanism, I think it's below 85% for more than 6 months, and your money will stop. So pretty tricky. I'm afraid we're going to have to stop there because it's coffee break. So try and get questions during the break. Thanks to all the speakers. Excellent presentations, keeping on time. And can we come back here, please, at 3 o'clock for the next session on international CCS?